Hello, lovelies. Happy New Year, and welcome to my first story of 2024. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this amusing tale of paranormal regret. The morning after. Thanks for the memory. With a desperate hand, Liz tried to reach the off switch on her radio alarm, while contemplating how to get revenge on her roommate for turning it up so loud. How Jessica had managed it from 200 miles away at her parents' place, Liz had no idea. But it had to have been her. It was deafening. Finally, she found the button and was rewarded with blessed silence. She flopped back onto the bed and refused to open her eyes for a while. Liz was not a morning person. She was especially not a morning person on New Year's Day. Lying there, with the duvet pulled up to her chin and only her arm and head poking out, she considered going back to sleep. It was Monday, but she didn't have to work at the pub until the evening. Working Christmas Day meant she hadn't had to work the New Year's Eve shift, since it was also her birthday. She'd promised to meet her best friend Nin for lunch, but she was sure she could fit in the shopping, cleaning up from the party the night before, and applying for the new job in something that was decidedly not the service industry before then. She was just slipping into a light doze when the radio blared again. She'd only managed to hit the snooze. This time, the whole alarm clock slipped off the bedside table as she frantically tried to shut it up. It went thankfully quiet, but by that time she was hanging half off the side of the bed. Jessica was going to die when she got home, and Liz had figured out how the prank had been pulled. "Bollocks," she said to the empty room, and pulled her dopey body into an upright position. That was when she noticed the ache in her neck. "Stupid pillow," she muttered to herself, and made possibly the 100th mental note to buy a new one. It was still dark outside as she padded her way to the bathroom. No one should have to get up when it was dark outside, in her very well-thought-out opinion. Winter was the worst. She would hate December if it wasn't for the fact she loved the Christmas cheer and her birthday. Luckily, she knew her way around the bathroom virtually with her eyes closed, because she could rarely be bothered to open them far in the mornings. She did turn on the main light, but instantly turned it off again because it offended her vision. Instead, she pulled the cord on the small light above the sink, which was a much more manageable dim yellow. She went through the motions of her morning routine, staring blankly into the mirror for most of it, as her brain ticked over at minimum revs. She might as well have kept her eyes shut for all she saw or comprehended. The brush, point blank, refused to go through her hair, so she grabbed a hair tie and put it back instead. The only real thought going through her head was for the coffee maker. Those little pods were calling her name. She needed caffeine. Making the decision to shower after she had cleaned the flat, she pulled on some old sweats and headed for the kitchen. It had been a wild party, and she smiled as she remembered bits of it. Of course, the living room was trashed. There were also 3 people sleeping in it. Liz stepped over the prone bodies, not even bothering to ascertain which of her friends had passed out on the floor. She would deal with them later. Coffee was her only desire. Someone had left the light above the hob on, so she went straight for the cupboard that held the caffeinated goodness. It was not the one that had the instant coffee, the tea, or the cheap pods she had accidentally bought that one time. In fact, to anyone opening it normally, it would look like it contained pasta and tins. Liz was no fool. She knew how to hide her caffeine stash. Just the smell of coffee helped to bring her brain back online. She had the water reservoir filled, the pod in the machine, and the mug under it in record time. Then, with glee, she pushed the on button and waited. It took a while to warm up, But then came the familiar noise of water being forced through coffee grounds, filling the kitchen with sound and the most wonderful aroma. She heard groans from the living room. As she took her first glorious sip of deep black heaven, a memory flashed through her sleepy mind. It was something to do with drinking as well, but it skittered away under the bliss of double espresso. Liz drank the whole mug in under a minute. Then she popped another pod in the machine, changed the setting and set it going again. She would savour the second one and maybe have some toast too. "Is that coffee?" she heard from behind her. "Touch my mug and you die," she said without bothering to turn around. "Wow, you're a bundle of joy in the mornings, aren't you?" She turned to find Pete standing in the doorway. He looked rumpled and barely awake. "How long have you known me?" she asked. "I refuse to say on account of you hurting me," Pete said. It might have been Liz's birthday the day before, but she had refused to let anyone mention her age. There had been forfeits and everything. "Didn't expect to see you before noon," Pete said, changing the subject, "especially with the fine specimen you were sucking face with last night." Liz frowned. "What?" "Don't tell me. You were so caffeine deprived this morning that you left him buried under the duvet," Pete said with a laugh. Liz tried to think. A vague memory filtered into her head, but it was very hazy. She didn't think she'd drunk that much the night before. "Liz?" Pete asked, smile dimming somewhat. "I woke up alone," she said, desperately trying to remember what had happened the previous night. "You let him get away?" Pete sounded scandalized. "He was so pretty, and wow, those eyes! I told you, you should have let me have him instead." At the mention of eyes, Lizzie's brain decided to use the caffeine she had already fed it, and there was nothing vague about the new memory. Piercing blue eyes she definitely remembered. They had almost glowed. "Coffee," she said, making grabby hands towards her mug. Pete dutifully handed it to her. She took a large swig. Slowly, a face began to resolve in her head. An absolutely gorgeous face with a heart-stopping smile. "Oh boy," she said. "Damn it, I should have chained him to the bed." More things began to come back to her now, and she smiled behind her coffee cup. Whoever had brought Mystery Man to the party had definitely brought her an extra birthday present. She had been too fast in blaming her pillow for the ache in her neck, because he'd been pretty obsessed with it. That was probably why she'd slept in an odd position. "You should have shared is what you should have done," Pete complained, and grabbed the kettle to fill it with water. "Not every man is gay, Pete," Liz pointed out. "Yeah, well, I was doing perfectly well until you made your second grand entrance," Pete complained. "I'll give you this one, but only because you were the birthday girl." Liz took another sip of her coffee, rubbing her neck absently as she mused over the previous night's activities. She wasn't usually into one-night stands, but Mystery Man had made every cell in her body light up like a firework display. How she had forgotten that, even temporarily, was beyond her. "Do you know who brought him to the party?" she asked, as she tried to recall everything she could. Pete shook his head. "I didn't see him come in." "Damn it, I'm going to have to go through everyone to track him down." "Not if I get there first," Pete said, with a very much not innocent smile. "He's my birthday present," Liz protested. "It's not your birthday anymore," Pete replied. "Why are we friends again?" Liz said, and drank some more coffee. "Because you love me," Pete said, and pulled a mug and the tea bags out of the cupboard. Liz narrowed her eyes, but that just made Pete smile even more, so she gave up. She was hungry, and after the physical exertion she was now starting to remember more and more clearly, she deserved breakfast. Grabbing the bread from the back of the cupboard, she walked over to the shiny new toaster Jessica had bought after destroying the last one with an ill-advised experiment involving a hot dog and 2 plastic forks. The new one was a gleaming chrome and took 4 slices. It had been in the sale or something. "Toast?" Liz asked as she popped in 2 slices for herself. "Thanks," Pete replied with a nod. The caffeine in her system was beginning to work, but after putting in 2 more slices for Pete, Liz still stood there staring at the toaster waiting for it to pop up, rather than doing anything else. It was as she did that, she began to realise something rather odd. She could see Pete pottering around making his tea, and she could see the rest of the kitchen and the shiny surface, but there was something missing from the cosy scene. Reaching out, she touched the metal side, just to check it wasn't some weird optical illusion. Her finger was right there, lightly resting on the side of the toaster, but reflected back at her in the shiny chrome, there was nothing. "Pete," she said, not trusting her early morning brain, "come here." "What?" Pete asked, only looking over as he poured water into his mug. "Come here," she repeated. With a long-suffering sigh, he put down the kettle and came over. "What do you see?" she asked. Pete frowned. "It's too early for this shit," he said, shaking his head. "Look at the toaster," she instructed, ignoring the protests. Rolling his eyes, Pete did as he was told. It took a few seconds, but then the frown deepened. Pete leaned closer. "How the hell?" Liz's hand went to the side of her neck again. "That's clever," Pete said, turning to her. "Now, how did you get Jessica to set that up?" Jessica was an engineer and a #1 prankster. Liz didn't blame Pete for asking at all. "Not a trick," she said. "Very funny," Pete said and snorted a laugh. "So you don't have a reflection?" She nodded. "Joke's over, Liz. I'm not falling for it." "Still not a joke," Liz replied and pulled open the drawer. She grabbed the large spoon that was reserved for special occasions and held it up next to her face. Pete stared at it. You really don't have a reflection," Liz said. Pete didn't wait for permission. He pushed her head to one side and looked at her neck. "Oh my God," he said, and she winced, not sure why. "You have a scar." "What kind of scar?" "Go look in the mirror." Liz just gave him her look for that. "Sorry," Pete apologised. "2 neat little round marks about 1 inch apart." Liz had many weaknesses, but failing to accept the reality of a situation that was staring her in the face was not one of them. "I'm a vampire," she said. "Mystery Man was a vampire, and now so am I." It was the only logical explanation. "You're not thirsty, are you?" Pete asked, and Liz rolled her eyes. Liz had kicked out the 2 people sleeping on her living room floor with paper cups of coffee and the toast she had discovered she couldn't eat. Then she had started calling around her other friends. It had taken her over an hour to find out who had brought Mystery Man. Turned out his name was Chris. If she was honest, she was shocked he had been so easy to track down. She was staring at his mobile number, for heaven's sake. Shouldn't vampires have been dark and mysterious and have just appeared out of the night? "Ring him," Pete said from his position in the kitchen doorway. "Easy for you to say," she said. "You have a reflection." Pete just rolled his eyes, giving her a hint she was being too whiny. Possibly she had been ranting quite a lot over the past hour and a half. If she was honest, the worst part had been not being able to eat her toast. She was starving, but when she tried to swallow it, she'd heaved it straight back up. She was also wearing sunglasses in the living room when outside it was barely light and all the curtains were closed. Pete was a very good meter for when she was overdoing it. She dialed the number and put her phone to her ear. "Hello?" said a sleepy voice. "What did you do to me?" she demanded as soon as she recognised Chris. "Oh," was not the so sleepy response. "I'll be over in 20 minutes. Then the phone went dead. Liz pulled it away from her ear and stared at the screen for a moment. "What happened?" Pete asked. "He hung up on me," she said, not sure how to take it. "Bastard," Pete said. "He's coming over." Oh. Pete didn't sound so sure about that. Liz looked at her friend and then he frowned, looking towards the window where a crack of light was making it through the curtains. "Hang on," he said. "It's daylight outside." "Maybe he has tunnels?" Liz said. She was so not in the mood. "I should rip your balls off," Liz said, the moment Chris walked through her front door. "Yes, well, you threatened to do that before," Chris said, sounding surprisingly resigned, "and you were holding them at the time." That wasn't how she had expected the conversation to go at all, and it floored her. "What?" Chris gave her an appraising look. "You don't remember, do you?" he said. She shook her head. "And that makes this all the more creepy," Pete said, standing in the kitchen doorway, holding the frying pan like a weapon. "You had sex with a drunk woman, and you turned her into a vampire." "Liz was not drunk," Chris said, and put his hands on his hips. If Liz hadn't known better, she would have said he was affronted. "Then why don't I remember?" she asked. "Sometimes the change affects the mind," Chris said. "You will remember, but it might take a couple of days." That sounded a little too convenient. "Is that an excuse?" She narrowed her eyes at him to make her point, and then remembered she was wearing dark glasses. "No, it's the truth," he insisted. "Then why did you leave?" That came from Pete. Chris sighed. "Sorry, Liz, but you had an adverse reaction to my blood. You became aggressive. I had to leave before you started tearing things apart. I told you all this in my note where I left my number." "There was no note," Liz said. "It was on your bedside table," Chris insisted. "How did you find me if not the note?" "I rang around." Oh. Liz couldn't help remembering how out of it she had been before her coffee. It was possible she had missed the note. She hadn't been back into the bedroom since she had realised what was happening. "You still turned me into a vampire," she said, remembering she was angry with him. "You made me." The sheer exasperation in Chris's voice actually encouraged her to believe him. "Yeah, right," Pete said. "Explain," is what Liz went with. Chris looked over at Pete, and his cheeks darkened a bit. Liz was almost amused, but only almost. After all, there was the whole vampire thing. "Well," he said eventually, "the sex was amazing, thanks. And then I bit you. You weren't supposed to remember that part, but when I tried to make you forget, you just blinked and told me it wasn't that easy." "Your vampire whammy doesn't work on me." He nodded. "Then just the bite didn't do this to me," she checked. "No," he said. "Can you imagine how many vampires there would be if it was like the movies? There would be more of us than there are regular humans." "So why am I like this now?" "Because you asked me to explain, so I did, and then you told me you wanted to be a vampire because you didn't want to grow any older." "So I'm immortal?" "Yes." "And what next?" "I said you had to wait and think about it. So you grabbed my balls and told me you didn't need to think about it and to do it right then." Pete actually laughed. "And what would you have done if a determined woman had your balls in her hand?" Chris demanded of Pete. At that, Pete stopped laughing and made a face. "Screamed a lot," he admitted. Chris made a C gesture, and Pete nodded. It seemed they agreed on something. "But vampires are stronger than humans," Liz said. "I know. I tried." There was a baking tray folded in half in the kitchen bin now. since it was the first thing she had been able to get her hands on to test things out. "I know," Chris said, and he didn't seem to be able to look at her. "Liz," surprisingly, Pete came to Chris's rescue. "When you have a man by the balls, strength does not come into it." Liz looked between the two. "God, I need more coffee," she said, and made herself shudder. So, daylight was what Liz said once they were all sitting down and she had more caffeine. "Fine, as long as you are fed and have this," Chris said, and held out a bottle towards her. "You have to be kidding," she said as she took the Factor 50 sun spray. "Best invention ever," Chris said. "Before that we had to wear hats and long sleeves all the time. Okay for the 18th century, but not the 20th. Liz sat back for a moment. "You sound like you're talking from personal experience," she said. "I am," Chris replied, "and before you ask, I will be 411 years old next March." Coffee almost hit the carpet, and that would have been sacrilege. Luckily, Liz saved her mug before it fell from her fingers. "Talk about sugar daddy," Pete said with a whistle. "What about eating?" she asked. "I tried toast." "You'll be fine in a few days," Chris assured her. "It's the adjustment. Blood and liquids will keep you going. Protein shakes are really useful, and once you're fully vampire, you can go back to eating normally. You might not like all the same things, though." All in all, Liz thought she could handle that. "And how do I feed?" She was nothing if not an upfront person. "I can hook you up with a supply," Chris said. "Or you can bite someone." Liz glanced at Pete. "Yeah, no," was her friend's immediate response. "I'm really hungry," Liz said, looking back at Chris. "I'll make a call," Chris said, and pulled out his phone. "You guys get takeout?" Pete sounded incredulous. Chris stood up with his phone to his ear and walked away to make his call. Pete moved closer to Liz. "Oh my God, Elizabeth, you have really done it this time," he whispered. Liz didn't bother mentioning that she was sure Chris could still hear them as she shuddered again. "Don't call me Elizabeth," she said automatically. She hated her full name. "At least he's not a werewolf, I suppose," Pete mused. Liz hit him with a cushion for that. "Werewolves aren't immortal," Chris said, coming back. "The delivery will be here in under 30 minutes. "Or your blood bags free?" Pete asked in the most innocent tone. If Pete was getting sarcastic, he was getting used to the whole idea. Liz took that as a good sign. "So there are werewolves?" Liz asked. Chris grimaced. "Filthy creatures," he said, and Liz couldn't help sensing there was history there. "What about witches and ghouls and goblins?" Pete asked. "Enough!" Both men looked at Liz as she shouted. "I can only take so many shocks in one day," she said. And Pete gave her a small smile of apology. "Thank God for that," he said, "or I'd think you completely changed." She shuddered again. "Okay," she said, "what's with all the jitters?" "Technically we're demons," Chris said, "so we react to religious things of all kinds. You'll get used to it, though. It's only if one of the crackpot hunters comes at you with crosses that you'll really feel it." There were too many things in that one speech for Liz to process all at once. Crackpot hunters was what she went with. "Most of us are live and let live," Chris said, "but there are some crazy humans out there who seem to think everyone is still living in the Dark Ages. Don't worry, the community deals with them when we come across them." Liz didn't like the sound of that. Deals with them? It sounded so final. "We turn them into vampires," Chris said with a shrug. "They mostly see the light when they are looking at it from the other side." "And if they don't?" "Do you really want me to tell you that now?" Liz took a very large swallow of her coffee and decided that perhaps she didn't. Pete was right. She really had done it this time. "What else did you fail to mention?" she asked. "I did tell you needed to stop and think about it," Chris pointed out. Liz would have liked to call bullshit, but now Chris had told her about it, she was beginning to remember more about the whole turning incident. "How do you look so well turned out when we don't cast a reflection?" she asked, because it was easier than admitting she had screwed up. "You can cast a reflection," he said. "You just have to really want to. It takes practice." "How is that even logical?" Liz shook her head in exasperation. Chris shrugged. "What's logic got to do with it?" Liz ran her hand through her hair, or tried, and then gave it up as a bad lot when her fingers got stuck. "And what about us?" she asked. "Well, as your maker, I have a duty to guide you through the start of your change," Chris said, and she noticed the way he looked down at the floor. She'd seen that look before on normal men. It was the morning after look. "And us?" Liz asked, feeling just a little evil. "Okay," Pete said, standing up. "That's my cue to leave. If you need anything, Liz, I will just be down the hall sharpening pencils into tiny stakes." Pete lived in the flat at the other end of the floor. Chris actually looked vaguely frightened about being left on his own with her. That brightened Liz's day considerably. She was a bit confused, a lot apprehensive, and very, very unsure of what she had gotten herself into. However, Liz was nothing if not forward-thinking. She didn't need a boyfriend just at the moment, but she was going to enjoy stringing Chris along at least for the next 20 minutes. Technically, she might have brought this on herself, but payback was a bitch. The vampire thing was new, but at least now she had plenty of time to get used to it.